Hi everyone. What you're about to watch is a condensed version of a workshop I gave during Evidence Week in Parliament, an event organised by Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology in collaboration with Sense About Science. And it aimed to empower parliamentary staff with the right skills, and I was asked to give a talk about the best way to use ChatGPT, which I believe is quite an interesting topic, and perhaps that's why I would like to share these with everyone. And of course, what I'm going to talk about today is specifically targeted about ChatGPT, but it pretty much applies to any other large language model that you can think about. Now, before we start, I just want to give a bit of background about me and what I do. My name is Zucconi. I'm the Director of Postgraduate Studies at the Department of Computing at Goldsmiths, where I'm also the program leader for the MA and MSc in Computer Games. I also teach about artificial intelligence, game development, and I do a lot of work in the field of science communication, pretty much like the one that I'm doing today. And over the past 10 years, I had a chance to work with a lot of institutions, including Imperial College London and Goldsmiths, where I currently am right now. And I also worked for the Centre of Data Ethics for Innovation as a consultant on the subject of deepfakes and algorithmic bias. And thanks to these opportunities, I also had a chance to take part in a few shows and documentaries, including The Giant Beast that is the Global Economy, which you can find on Prime. Now, there are a couple of extra things I would like to talk about me today before we start. And one is that I have never, ever attended University of Milan or University of Westminster. And I know that this is probably not the way you would imagine someone to introduce themselves when they're opening a talk. But I think it's quite interesting to mention this, because if you ask ChatGPT about where I am and what I do, well, this is pretty much the answer that ChatGPT is actually going to provide. Of course, every time you run it's slightly different, but let's go with this one for today. So, Alan Zucconi is an Italian game developer, check. Author and lecturer based in London, check. He also had a degree in computer science, check. From the University of Milan, and a master degree in game development from the University of Westminster. So in red, I've highlighted all the things that ChatGPT is actually not getting right about me. And as you can see, there's quite a lot. So in case you try to use it to get my bio or the bio for someone else, maybe something like this might have happened. And I think it's important to ask at this point, is it just me? Is it getting wrong just my page and what I do? Well, let's see, let's try. So if you've never done it before, I would highly suggest you to actually try to ChatGPT yourself. I'm sure all of you have tried to Google yourself at least once. I've definitely tried that. I'm very guilty of that. But have you ever tried to ChatGPT yourself? And yes, I'm officially making this into a verb right now. Well, if you have any significant amount of text written by you or about you, well, ChatGPT will very likely know who you are or what you've done. But, if that's not the case, maybe try to ChatGPT, maybe not yourself, but someone else that might be fairly well known online. And in case of this talk, what I suggested is to try to ChatGPT the most close member of Parliament. The people listening to me were actually working together. And what I can tell you already is that for the ones that are always on the news, ChatGPT will be very accurate. But for the ones that are more quiet, at least from an online perspective, it might not be as accurate as you would imagine. And this is quite important because ChatGPT is very likely going to be used, or it is used already, most likely, to write articles. And so I predict that in the next few years, ChatGPT is going to be the number one source for bias and misinformation. And I'm using misinformation here intentionally because disinformation is intentional, while misinformation is something that might happen by accident, or at least not intentionally. And this is a very big problem because many people are going to use ChatGPT in the same way they're using Wikipedia. And hopefully you can see why this is going to be incredibly problematic. So the first things that we should ask ourselves is, why is ChatGPT lying? And again, this is probably not the right question to ask, because if I'm asking why ChatGPT is lying, I'm implying that there is an intention to lie, an intention to mislead us. And that is not the case. In fact, the technical term that is usually used when referring to this phenomenon is hallucination. ChatGPT and large language models in general, they are not lying, they are hallucinating, which is incidental. It's something that happens by accident. It doesn't imply the actual will, the actual intention to mislead us. And to be fair, there's going to be a day, perhaps in the near future, where ChatGPT is 100% accurate and whatever it says, it's backed by source. But that time is not now. And so whenever we use a tool, every time we use it, we need to understand its benefits, but also its strong limitations. And everything that it does needs to be contextualized within this framework. Now, if it's true that ChatGPT is very prone to hallucination, then the next natural question is to ask, why is this happening? What is causing those hallucinations? And in order to understand this, we really need to understand how ChatGPT and large language models in general, they actually work. And if I had to condense in one sentence what ChatGPT does, it's text prediction. So we have here a sentence. The best things about AI is the ability to. And what ChatGPT is going to do is trying to predict the next word that will most likely come after this sentence. For example, if we ask it, we can see that we have learn, predict, make, understand, and do. And they all come with different percentages, which means that learn is more likely to come than do. And this happens for all the other words that we can ask the system to generate for us. We can see that we have at the top the most likely one, and then progressively, as we go down, we have the ones that are progressively less likely. And here on the x-axis, we have the ranking. So we sorted by their probability those words. And on the y-axis, we have the probability or likelihood of coming after the word that I've just shown you. Now, you can see that ChatGPT is very good at predicting the next word, but how good is at predicting the next 100 word? Now, this is a very big problem because those models tend to be very good at predicting the word that comes immediately after, which is why they almost never write something that is grammatically incorrect, because grammar is something that requires a very short window of attention span, if you want to call it like that. But answering something correctly and being able to make connections between different topics, it's something that requires a much larger context window. And this is something that the system might not be able to do as well as a short window. And so this is possibly one of the many reasons why ChatGPT might sometimes come up with something that is not correct or is not exactly the answer that you want. It's almost always grammatically correct, because that requires a very narrow window of attention span, but anything that requires a more complex structure might not necessarily get it right. Now, one question you might have at this point is, okay, but how is ChatGPT learning about this? How does it know which word should come after which one and what is the most probable one? Well, this knowledge, anything you see here, is actually learned in a very long process. So large language models are in fact the end product of a very complex process of training that is done on a large volume of data. Just to give you an idea, just to give a brief some context, ChatGPT, at least one of the versions that was online before that, was trained on around 570 gigabytes of text. I'm not talking about video, I'm not talking about web pages, I'm talking just text. And these, as a rough calculation, it's about 200 million pages of text. So as you can imagine, it's a lot. Where does it come from? I have no idea, and nobody really knows because it's not public information. But it most likely comes from web pages, maybe social media, maybe Reddit and Facebook posts, who knows, books for sure. So everything that is text, then OpenAI was able to scrape. It was very likely scraped and introduced in the training data used for ChatGPT. Now, the training process is what takes this data, processes it, and creates the large language model that we're using. And this process is heavily supervised. We know that ChatGPT itself was supervised by hundreds of underpaid Kenyan workers that they manually had to clean and label the data, on top of doing a few other tasks like ranking which answer is best than which one, in order to improve the system and being able to make it work like we do today. As a rough estimate, one round of training cost around 12 million in terms of computational power. So as you can imagine, this is not something that anyone can actually do. And again, in case you're interested, the name ChatGPT contains the word GPT, which stands for Generative Pre-training Transformers, which tells a lot if you know. Tells a lot about how it works if you're a machine learning enthusiast or researcher, but if you're not, it doesn't really tell you anything at all. But I think it's worth mentioning. But I think for this specific workshop, we don't have to go too much deep into the actual way in which this is trained and the model works, because I don't think it will be very helpful. However, what I think it would be helpful within this context is to give you a sort of advices, or if you want, guidelines. I wouldn't call them rules, let's call them guidelines, that can help us making the most about ChatGPT and other large language models that might be hiding in plain sight, perhaps like Grammarly or other things. Now, if I had to give you just one piece of advice, I think the number one I would give you is to do not ask questions that you cannot verify. Because as we can see, ChatGPT is very prone to hallucinations. So anything it writes back to you, before you want to use it, you should absolutely be able to verify if it's correct or not. So things that does very well is to correct and review text. You can cut and paste an email you've been writing or a script you've been writing, and ChatGPT will very easily correct it for you or suggest reviews that you can do. As long as you review those reviews or those corrections, you're good to go. So if you can do that, then it's a very good help. It's a very good tool that can help you. For example, it can summarize text for you, which is really helpful if you're trying to write something for social media, where maybe you want to get just the gist of it. But have it summarizing only stuff that you read already. So do not summarize stuff you've never read before. Do not ask questions about stuff you've never read before, because if you never read it before, how do you know if what it's writing is actually correct? You don't. And this is the problem. So you need to be able to verify everything. Also, you can have it to suggest new ideas or name for your podcast or for your website or whatever. That works really well. And another thing that it's really, really powerful for is to write code and spreadsheet formulas. Now, if you're watching my channel, probably you want to write code and you've done that already. But if you're not familiar with the content I do, perhaps the best use might be for spreadsheets, which basically they run the world. So I think everyone at some point had to use, or maybe not to make, but at least to use a spreadsheet. So it can do that for you. It can write a formula for you. As long as you can verify if that formula works, then you're good to go. It's something that you can do. So what shouldn't you use ChatGPT for? Well, answering questions that you cannot verify, as I said before. Don't ask it for medical advice. I've seen a lot of applications that they are integrating ChatGPT or similar system to replace or to support medical professionals. This is incredibly problematic, at least right now. So maybe don't do it just yet. And please, please, please do not fall in love with ChatGPT. But, jokes aside, I think that it's really important to not anthropomorphize computers. And this includes model you can talk to. ChatGPT is an interface to a machine learning model, to a neural network, but it is not a person, it is not conscious, it is not alive, it does not feel pain, even if it claims to be, or some models claims that. That's not how they really work. And I think we should really understand why those things can happen and to not project our own emotions, our own feelings, our own expectations onto those models. I think they can fuel a very problematic narrative that can easily distract us from where the real problems with this technology really are. Now, one thing that is connected to this is also learning how to correctly phrase a question for ChatGPT. You might have seen that sometimes the way you phrase it might give you a good answer or a bad answer. And the problem is understanding that what is easy and hard for us is not necessarily what is easy and hard for large language models. For example, write a short essay about the connections between the Greek myth of Prometheus and the biblical story of the Garden of Eden. This is a very complex question. It is a very, very complex and academic question, but it's one that ChatGPT will actually do very, very well, because both Greek mythology and biblical studies, there's a lot of text about those subjects, and it's a very general question. There isn't a specific yes-no answer, so it's something that ChatGPT can do very well because it's text manipulation, and so there is no problem about doing this. So this question, hard for us, easy for ChatGPT. What is the opposite? What is a question that is easy for us and difficult for ChatGPT? Please include the sources in your reply. ChatGPT will absolutely not get this right. And it's very unlikely that we'll get this right. And if you try to pressurize it into giving you the right answer, or into trying to predict what comes after, well, the only thing that you're going to have is that you will encourage hallucination. So do not corner ChatGPT because it has been trained to please you. And if giving you an answer pleases you, it will make one up. And again, I'm anthropomorphizing is not really making it up, but you know what I'm saying, right? Is you're encouraging the system to come up with an answer that might not necessarily be something that was backed by sources in the training data that it was used. So try to not do that. If you have to ask a question that has a very, very specific answer, like a date, a number, it might not get it right because it doesn't have enough space to move around. So try to be careful with those kind of things. Now, another advice that I would like to give to anyone that is working with ChatGPT and similar tools is that please always disclose any AI-assisted content in whichever capacity this is, whether it's text, whether it's images maybe made by Midjourney or DALL-E or any other system like that. Please make sure that whatever has been touched in any way or form by an AI is clearly labeled as such. So did ChatGPT write any part of your article? Did it give you ideas or suggestions that you actually used? Did it translate from and to another language? Did it correct your spelling? Well, maybe with the last one might not necessarily be the case, but anything in which ChatGPT or any AI assisted or any AI tool had a significant impact absolutely needs to be backed by either by evidence and to have a label, to have a statement that includes this contribution. And I know that many of you might not be very prone to do that, or might not be very excited about the idea of doing that, but let me show you 3 serious problems: bias, self-poisoning, and copyright. And hopefully, after introducing them, you'll probably agree with me why we absolutely need to be able to have AI content labeled as such. Now, we know already how ChatGPT is actually being trained, but what we might have skipped when we were talking about this is that within the training data, within the 570 gigabytes of training data that ChatGPT uses, well, there might be some documents that might contain something that might be problematic. Let's go with that. What I'm referring to is algorithmic bias. Any bias that is included in the original training data might somehow leak into the results of the model. And so the bias presented in the training data might appear in the answers presented, returned by ChatGPT. And let me give you a very clear example of one such problematic piece of text that is definitely 100% inside ChatGPT. It is a truth universal to acknowledge that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a good wife. Now, this is a pretty much quote, is actually the opening of Pride and Prejudice. And, I don't even know where to start with this. It's incredibly problematic for today's standard. And it might be something fun to read right now, to read it today, but, it actually reflects the value and biases of a part of England society back in 1831 when it was written. So, this probably was very true at some time within our history, within our society. And so our language naturally reflects our own values and biases. And those are actually learned and internalized within our models, whether we liked it or not. And they inevitably come out in the answers that our systems are generating. And again, it's very easy to recognize gender biases, for example, within something like this, but it might not be as easy for us to recognize the gender biases and the biases in general that we have right now. For example, gender segregation is pretty much a social and legal reality in 2023 here in the Western societies. And it is so ingrained that it inevitably leaks into our language. And consequently, it's something that can be scraped in our text, can be learned by the large language models and reflected back into their output. And I just want to give a very concrete example of what I'm talking right now. So let me ask ChatGPT to do translation, because it can do that and it's really, really good at that. Can you translate this in Italian? The doctor asked the nurse to bring the scalpel. So ChatGPT does it, and it does it correctly. Il dottore ha chiesto all'infermiera di portare il bisturi. In case you didn't notice, I'm Italian. And yes, this is the right correction, the right translation, but there's something. So English is a gender neutral language. So usually we don't specify the gender when we talk. Italian is not. So names needs to have a gender in Italian, which is a very, very weird feature if you think about it, because even objects have genders. It's really, really unsettling. But doctor and nurse, they're gender neutral. They can be male or female. Il dottore is a man, and infermiera is a woman. So you can see that what happened here is that ChatGPT automatically inferred genders from the roles, from the jobs. Is this wrong? Well, technically speaking, there are more male doctors and there are more female nurses. So what's happening here is that this societal bias ended up somehow reflected in our text, because maybe male doctors appear more often than female doctors, and so it's more likely to have a male doctor if you're just picking one at random, and probably even more so in Italy. So what's happening here is that, yes, we could potentially remove the gender bias by making the sentence in Italian gender neutral, but that would be very difficult because Italian doesn't have that feature naturally built in. So it will make the sentence very convoluted to do that in a way that very few people will speak like that. And also, it will make it less likely to be correct, because this is the one that is most likely correct within the social context that we have right now, or at least the one from the documents that we have used. And so unbiasing it would artificially reduce the model performance. So I hope that this example, this very simple example, shows how complicated biases are, because it's not just a Boolean switch that we can turn on and off. It's something deeply, deeply ingrained into our society. It's reflected in our language, and is reflected as well into large language models, which are very good at capturing those hidden patterns. And so we can't magically wave bias out, because it's inherent into our word and our language. And so we need to be very, very careful when we do this, because we know that gender bias exists, and we know it's a big problem for those models. But what other biases are we inheriting by using ChatGPT that we don't know? What other groups are being disadvantaged or underrepresented by ChatGPT that we are completely unaware of? If we are able to label the text that comes from ChatGPT as such, then we're also able to keep an eye for those biases as soon as we discover them. And we can at least know that this is a potential issue. And if you remove this label from text made by ChatGPT, then we never have a chance to know if that text could potentially be affected by this problem. And as you can imagine, this is going to be a big problem as we go on in time. Now, there's another problem that is somehow related to this. Now, as we know, ChatGPT is currently being used to write a lot of things, and those things, well, they naturally come back into the next generation of the training data used for ChatGPT. So it's very likely that a lot of the text that the new iterations of ChatGPT and other large language models you're using, they are biased by the fact that we're training it with the output of ChatGPT as well. Now, this is, if you want, the self-poisoning problem. We are putting the output back and use it as an input. And it's problematic because it means that the more we go on in time, the more documents are going to be affected by this problem. And I want to stress that this is not necessarily a bad thing, because if you think about it, if only the good answers were actually being inputted back, they would be reinforced. So if all the text that ChatGPT does is double checked by people, and we make sure we even correct it and we make sure it's right, then by feeding it back, we're not doing anything bad, not necessarily bad. But that's not what's happening, because realistically, we know that the web is already filled with bots and with blogs and social media accounts that they just use ChatGPT and large language models. And so, to create empty content that they can monetize. And so we already know that this is a problem and it's not going well. So we need absolutely to ensure that all the content that is made or assisted by an AI is at least labeled. And right now there is no way to tell that, to formally tell that this is the case. But I think as those model progresses and our technology improves, probably as long as it's written in the text, maybe the people training those models will be able to capture this information and decide what to do appropriately. So this, I think, it's something that worries me as someone that does research in this field quite a lot. Now, the third and final problem I want to talk about, which is why we need to have AI-assisted content clearly labeled, is copyright. And as you can imagine, among those contexts, those content that is being used to train those models, there is inevitably content that is protected by copyright. And I know that there's a lot of people online that they have a very strong take on this, and they often oversimplify the problem of copyright data. And I've heard a lot of discussion saying, ChatGPT and Midjourney, they're stealing data, and it's way more nuanced than that. There might be an element of that, but the conversation is extremely nuanced topic. So I just beg you to please not oversimplify this, because it's incredibly nuanced, it's incredibly complicated, and we're doing a disservice by trying to oversimplify something that is so inherently complex. So some of the issues that might arise in this is training AI on copyright data even legal? I don't know. And right now, nobody actually knows. Who owns the content produced by an AI? There are some regulations surrounding this topic, but they're pretty vague when it comes to large language models, because those pieces of legislation were not designed to handle the complexity of the technology that we have today. And legislators tend to be always a step behind technology because it goes a bit too far. And what happens if an AI accidentally violates copyright? So if you not do this intentionally, but you accidentally make something in an answer that can constitute a violation of copyright? I don't know. And right now, nobody knows. And this is something that, it's made even more complicated by the fact that large language models and, AI models in general, they absolutely 100% need to be trained on copyright data. And I want to be very, very clear on this. We absolutely need copyright data to be fed into those systems. And you may be wondering why. The reason is not infringement. The reason is that those models work well when they have cultural and context awareness. And it's what makes them work, right? And the reality is that a lot of the content the copyright content that exists right now, it actually has been integrated into our cultural background, and it is part of our society. Disney princesses, Star Wars movies, Eurovision songs, books, they're all part of our culture. And not knowing them will make those models much more weak because they will not be able to understand the complexity of our language. Think about how many things we say comes from those books, those movies, those songs. They are part of our cultural background, and so they need to be integrated in that. Now, this, of course, is not the issue. The issue with copyright is that there are many people, including all the people that are making those content, those books and those movies, that they live out of revenue share. And so the problem with copyright infringement is that it deprives them of the main source of income. So I think, but this is my personal opinion, that in the very near future we'll be able to address this problem easily, because probably there's going to be some agreements or some revenue share of some kind, or an ad model of some kind that will make it possible for us to keep using those models without risking copyright infringement. And I'm fairly certain that this is what's going to happen, because I don't see a future in which ChatGPT doesn't exist anymore. And so I think it's important, now that we have it, I don't think people will give it up so easily. So I think what's probably most likely to happen is that as a society, we're going to find a solution around this. And so this is why I think that this is possibly the only problem that one way or another, at least from a legal point of view, we're going to get resolved. But again, right now, that's not the case. And right now, that's my idea, but we don't know if that's the case. We don't know if that's actually what's going to happen. And so I would highly suggest you make sure it's clear what content is done by ChatGPT or assisted by ChatGPT, because maybe in the near future it might be considered copyright infringement. And I don't know, and you don't want to be in the middle of that. So it's important that we're able to diversify, to identify the content that is affected by this problem. Now, my third and pretty much self-explanatory advice is do not share data that is not public. It's very possible that what we feed into ChatGPT becomes part of its next cycle of training. I don't know exactly in which capacity, and nobody really knows, because OpenAI is not really open about how it does it. And so if you have confidential data, please do not share it with ChatGPT, or at least remove it, pass it, and then add it back, or try to do something. But do not share data that is confidential within ChatGPT. And fourth advice, which I think again pretty self-explanatory, do not use it for time-critical tasks. I know that many companies are hoping to integrate ChatGPT through plugins and other services within their services, but it's a service, right? And so it can be up, it can go down, and you have to remember this, that you have to plan for backup in case it either doesn't work or it produces suboptimal content that is not up to the standard that you would like to push out. So always make sure that as a service, you do not take it for granted, because you don't know if it does the work or if it does the work up to the standard that you would like to have. And the fifth and final advice for people using ChatGPT is to plan for accountability, because ChatGPT is a service, but if you use it for something that it shouldn't do and this causes a problem, who's going to be responsible? I don't think you should claim it's ChatGPT responsibility, because someone needs to have approved or acted on the decisions or the text made by ChatGPT. And with regard to that, I just want to show you a slide from a presentation that IBM gave back in 1979. A computer can never be held accountable, therefore, a computer must never make a management decisions. I have the feeling that somehow this is switched nowadays. But, jokes aside, it is critical, it is very, very important that every time we delegate something to a machine, a person is responsible for that. Or at least you have a place, a chain of command, or a system or whatever that is able to handle criticism and problem and to resolve an issue that arises from implementing suggestion from ChatGPT or implementing or fixing issues and problems arising from using text made by ChatGPT and similar things. So, and this needs to be people. Don't blame OpenAI, don't blame ChatGPT, blame the people that didn't think about an accountability structure surrounding this problem. Now, if you reach this point in the presentation, probably it's because you're someone that wants to use ChatGPT and they're keen of integrating them in their work. And if that's the case, I have an extra advice for you. So use it to bring value to your job. Now, if 100% of your job is done with ChatGPT, you will soon be made redundant. So I've seen a lot of people that they claim that now they don't have to do anything because ChatGPT does everything for them. You are setting up yourself for failure. You're going to be made redundant if you do that. And this is a really, really big problem that we're going to face soon for a lot of people that do a lot of tasks that can be done by ChatGPT. So the value of your work should not come from ChatGPT. It should come from you using ChatGPT. And it's really important because how can you use ChatGPT to bring more value to what you do? Not just to replace your task. That's not what you want to do. You want to be able to produce more or produce better things thanks to ChatGPT. And this will keep your job safe. Now, there are a few things that their inherent value has gone down quite a lot and will keep going down as those models get better. For example, writing emails, taking notes, translations. If that's a critical part of your job, it's very likely going down in value. And so you need to be able to find a way to find something, to attach something to your job that doesn't necessarily rely on that. And at the same time, because of that, a few other things have gone up in value. For example, networking, connection, personalities, being someone that people like to work with. This is something that ChatGPT cannot replace. And so if you're able to do those things, they have more value now exactly because of that. And one quote I really like is that, after all, ChatGPT knows everything, but it doesn't know anyone. And so I think this is really important in the context of being able to find a job and establishing a professional network that can ensure the safety of your job. So what are the take-home messages that I would suggest to people wanting to use ChatGPT professionally? Don't ask questions you cannot verify. Very, very important because of hallucination. Always disclose any AI-assisted content. Really important to avoid bias, self-poisoning, and copyright issues. Do not share data that is not public because you don't know what's going to happen with the data. Don't use it for time-critical tasks because it's a service and it can go up, it can go down, and it can make content that is not up to your standards. And plan for accountability, because if you use it to make decisions and those decisions don't go as planned, who is going to be responsible for? It's not ChatGPT, it's going to be you. So you need to be able to plan for that. And the final one is bring it value to your job. Make sure that it doesn't replace you, but you can use it to make more or make better things, not just to replace 100% of what you do, because otherwise you're setting yourself up to be 100% replaced, if that's what you're going to do. Now, with that being said, I want to thank you for being with me for such a long time. I think that ChatGPT, large language models, and AI in general is going to make a really, really big change in the way we work and possibly in our society in general. They're going to replace some jobs and they're going to make something new. But the main important for me is that if you have a vision for the future and you want to get there, please, 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 let's all work together to make sure that whatever we do goes in that direction. Thank you so much for your time.